So our first demonstration is going to be this shoe, the boot. This is a nice, easy asset, and it demonstrates all the principles that we've been speaking about. The next one I'm going to do is the trouser, which is a little bit more involved, but it's still fairly simple. Then we're going to cover the things like the buckles, showing you the other techniques of just bringing in our base assets that have decent topology and using that. And then we'll go over the face and hands, and for the body it literally is just loops around the body, so I'll just show you guys that by that point you guys will be proficient enough to use it. A demonstration will suffice. So for this asset, let's go ahead and make this live. So we're going to use the exact same techniques, and we're going to go to quad draw. Now, what do we need to do when we're modeling this? The first thing that I'll do is I'll lay out my polygons in an animation friendly way. So that's with quads, because quads are predictable, and then we'll insert triads. Now you may be wondering, how do I know, or how am I judging where to place these points? Well, I'm looking for the peaks, and I'm looking for the most even way of placing it. So you can see that on most of these places it's a peak around here. It goes down a little bit, but we'll ignore that. Peak there, in the middle of this peak, that's pretty much a straight line. Peak there, so on and so forth, right? So we're just looking for the peaks and the midpoints, and you'll see why we're looking for the peaks of this very soon. So I look from above to make sure that this is a point that's pointing out, and again we're just making sure this is relatively evenly spaced. And at this point you'll notice something, but when we draw this out we'll see. So for this I'm just going to put 2 points underneath, and I'm going to draw my first poly. So this is placing our first poly, right? And now I'll just do this for every other one. So like I said, I like doing this for every other piece of geo, and then I'll go ahead and bridge these in a second. So I'm just placing 2 and dropping it, and I'll say something else that I'm considering after we finished as well. So something to take note of is that, notice that some of these are straight and some of them I've done so that they roughly follow the form that's underneath. So for example, this one, we can see that this fold is running down in this direction, so I've done it so it's roughly following that form, because there's no real point of me making it straight, and again you'll see a little bit more about that in a second. Now if you did make it straight, that's not the worst thing in the world, and again you'll see why in a second. I promise you guys will see. It's just that rather than me saying it, I will show you. So okay, so very simple, drawn these out. We're just making sure that they're fairly evenly spaced, and that's our first row. Now for this we could either drag out every other point, or we could just use that, not trick, but we could use the shortcut that we saw and press tab, middle mouse button click, and drag this down. Now don't drag it down too low, otherwise it becomes sometimes difficult to select things and it just becomes annoying to work with. So just drag it down a decent amount where we're like, okay, this looks like another row could fit in here, so I'll just insert that row, and then I'll make sure these also line up to the peaks. So what we're trying to do is you can see in the silhouette, we're trying to get these high points of the mesh selected. Right now I don't mind putting this in a valley, so you can see this is the lowest point around here, and I don't mind putting it in that, and I'll show you guys why in a second. But you can see from the silhouette we need to change this, right? But for now we can ignore it, and let's just make sure that this, so with things like this, we don't want this to be in the recess, we want it to be again at the peak. And we can see that it would be nice if we had another edge here to hold that silhouette, right? So again, I'm just going to make sure this is at the peak, and initially we don't need to worry about all of that, we will go back through. So again, let's drop this down, and our shoe naturally ends at this line. There's a seam here, so when you're doing retopology, try to keep a loop around things like seams, or very close to things like seams. Around is much preferred, so keep a loop around your seams, because when we eventually cut this, or when you have this and when you're texturing over this asset, it makes your life a lot easier. And again, this is something that you'll appreciate more when we actually begin texturing, but just take my word for it for now. Okay, so we're just putting all of these points down so they're low. And one thing you'll see happen right here, you can see I can't select this, well, I can, but it's hard for me to select this point, and you can see it's gone inside of the mesh. Now to get that back, all I need to do is press Q to go back, well, to come out of that tool and just go in selection mode. Then I'm going to go to vertex selection mode, and you can see we can't see this vert on the surface anymore. So if that happens, just select below the surface, press W to go into move mode, and then just push that out. And this is why we use the component mode. If we go to object mode, it can get pushed out, don't get me wrong, but it's also pushing it back. And if I do this, it's also pushing it forward. So with component mode, we literally just push it out of the surface, and that makes our life a lot easier. Then we can just go back to quad draw, and you can see we can start again, and we can select this perfectly fine, and it's not inside the mesh anymore. So that's just how you fix those. Very simple. Just tap Q, get out of that mode, and get back in after you finish. So let's have a look. Let's make sure this is fairly even, and we're just going to insert another point here. So this works, and these points are getting fairly close, so we'll move these out to space them out. And this is when smoothing comes in handy. So if I just hover over those verts, you can see just those verts get smoothed, and we have tons of geo to fill. You can see all of this silhouette, we need to support that. This part of the silhouette, we need to support that, as well as this piece at the back. And don't worry, this is all perfectly fine. So maybe you see this, and right now I'm thinking I want to insert another loop, at least another loop around this section, and I want these to be a little straighter. So the way to do that is we can come off of quad draw, and I press Q, but you guys can just select this icon here, go into edge mode, right click, drag up to edge, double click this icon, and we can press 4 if you want to see those points easier. This just goes into wireframe mode. And because we have a live selection, let me just come out of this for a second. Because we have a live selection, no matter what move I do to this asset, you can see it sticks to the surface, right? So that makes our life a lot easier, because now we can go on here, select the edge, I'm going to go to 4, and I'm just going to go to scale mode, which is right down here, or if you press R. And what I'm going to do is, I can leave this on object mode, that's fine. I'm just going to scale all of these down, and you can see now they become flat. Likewise for this loop, now they become flat. And I don't want that to be totally flat, I don't mind this one. And for this loop, I'm just going to do it with component mode selected. So you'll see this will angle it to the average of all of these edges. And that's just useful because we don't always want it to be completely flat. And you can see this angle's off. Well, all we have to do is rotate this, and it's just very easy to work with, right? So that's fine. One thing I want to do is slide these edges around a little bit. So we're going to shift right click after double selecting that edge, and then we're going to go to slide edge again, and we're going to use our middle mouse button to move this down. So I just want to space this out differently. Slightly up, and this is fine. So now in here, we're just going to insert another loop. And if we don't want to have to do that, we can just go back to quad draw mode, press 5 to come out of wireframe mode, and then we can press B for soft selection. And you can see my soft selection radius is very small here. So if I hold B and then just click and drag, you can see now I've made that radius bigger. If I press shift, now that radius will affect my smooth, and you can just see how nicely smoothing will react to this. So instead of flattening everything, we could have done this with the smooth, but I like to use both, so I want to make sure you guys know the sort of traditional way of doing it and the modern way of doing it. Okay, so after smoothing, notice that some of our points has dipped inside of the surface. So there's a few ways we can handle this. We could smooth with an offset, but again, I only like having a very slight offset because sometimes some surfaces will be offset too much, some will be too little, so on and so forth. So I just prefer to manually control everything. That way I know it all works. And I'm just going to press B. Now the easiest way to see when a surface is offset too much is you start to get the gray of the mesh. Sometimes this is fine, but other times you know it means trouble. In our case it means trouble because we also can't see the vert, right? So we can barely see it there. So all I'm going to do is pop that out. And now when I go to quad draw mode, you can see we can see less of that surface underneath. The other thing that this means is just that we're not at the peak of this shape yet, or we need more edge loop supporting this. So that's perfectly fine. We'll still get a good bake from this because there's not too much variation in the surface. From the silhouette, you can see the silhouette isn't poking out too much, right? So that's still fine. Now, let's finish the rest of this and then we'll get into cutting more shapes. But one thing we do need to consider, so I like the density of this top piece now, so I just want to make sure I keep this density roughly going on around this mesh. So let's select this, and for this I'm actually not going to extrude the entire edge. I want to very meticulously or carefully select this edge here, and that's just so I make sure I get the shape that I want. And a lot of the times with quad draw you do have to move your camera around, so you can see this piece has become a little difficult to select, so you just have to shuffle that a little bit, and now you can see it's perfectly fine. And I hold shift. So same thing with this, I'm just going to move this around a little bit, angle my camera slightly differently. Now you can see we can select it, and on here you can see that our silhouette isn't fully being supported by this. It would be nice if we had another shape here just to keep that edge clean, but again that's not essential. But for some of the areas we will be adding that in because this is too much. There's too much room at this stage, so we definitely want to support that again later on. Now for this point we'll want to support that again as well, but we'll get to that. Oops. So let's move this. So I'm going to go ahead and just finish retopologizing all of this piece, and then I'll be back. Okay, so now what we want to do here is I've reached basically the bottom of this, but now we're going to have a change in angle because you can see these points lead down here. This one needs to curve with the shoe, so we need to make this all work, and we need to also support this buckle that's here, and that really depends. So again, if we're doing a game mesh, this, if I had points like this, that really wouldn't, if we're doing a mobile game mesh, sorry, because we are doing a game mesh, but if I just did this, that really wouldn't be so bad. And even if I did this with this mesh, it probably wouldn't be so bad, but we have enough pulleys to spare, so we can go into more detail than this. Because from this far, you don't see that the silhouette's missing, right? You don't see some points. It's just that when we get this close, we can see that the silhouette needs more and this point's poking out and stuff like that. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna spend the time and really support those shapes. So let's continue, and all this is going to be is just more pulleys being drawn over the top. So again, this is going to be a little time lapse. So at this stage, all I'm going to do is just drop this point in. So we just made a quad there. So drop this point in and move it over there to make it a triangle. Alternatively, what we could have done, like I said before, hold tab and then just pull this point out and drag it over in a corner. So whatever way you guys feel is the best way for you guys. So an important thing that I did here was to make sure that these 2 points begin right on the edge of this strap so we can follow this around. If I decided to put it just before, our next edge has to be around here in the middle to keep it fairly even and consistent with these. And if we were to do it close, then it's just too close. We don't need edge to be that close. So all I do is stretch this one out, move this one forward a little bit, and then I continue beyond that. So same here, I just made sure to have this edge line up with that strap going around there. So for this, we can go about this 2 ways, right? Now again, it really depends on the fidelity that you want to get into. We can either decide to bring this lip down again to support the silhouette, and we're going in even finer detail here. Or we can decide to just bring this edge up here. Just move these up. And you can see that these are dipping into the surface, so we'll just push those out. Make sure all of those edges are out. And you can see that we could bring this here. And this is what I meant when I mentioned finding the peak of the surface. So this is a peak, that's a peak. But if we were to put this at somewhere below a peak and this at somewhere below a peak, you can now see that this mesh just fully penetrates through. And you can see that grey appearing. So we just want to find a nice comfortable place for this to sit. That's also fitting our spacing fairly evenly. So we can see that edge dived in a little bit. So yeah, for this demonstration, I'm just gonna go the way of going the shorter way, just so I can continue, and then I'm just gonna insert an edge loop here so you can see that captures that silhouette nicely enough. But for my actual mesh, I do go ahead and I do add the lip as well, just for the sake of it. That's what I do when I'm modeling. But you guys can pick either. Honestly, this is a learning experience for a lot of you guys, so save your time, and you don't need to go in and do every little detail because it won't really be seen in the end. On your next character that you guys do after this class, you can feel free to go crazy and do all the extra stuff that nobody will notice. So for this, you can see that we have quite a big gap here, right? So all I want to do is go to the multi-cut mode, and this is when it becomes really useful, because in quadro mode we can't draw individual verts. What we could do is we could insert a vert here, move this in, and then just delete by pressing Control Shift and delete that entire edge from the top. So let me zoom out and do that again. What we did is insert an edge loop there, move this point in, and then deleted that edge loop. Now the issue with that is that it won't mess your topology up, but when, again, for you guys that are beginning and when you're uncomfortable, don't do that, just because you may just introduce random problems without knowing. What you should be doing if you're uncomfortable and not so used to using this is pressing Control Shift, going to multi-cut mode, or going down here and just clicking multi-cut and then just drawing out this new point. That way we know that nothing's going to be introduced and we're only inserting that point. So now you can see that with the top of this, we get a lot better. Silhouette. We're just going to introduce this. We're going to add a triangle there. We can. So this is when you're going to start seeing me cutting in triangles, and you're going to notice, oh, this is why we cut in triangles. But I'm going to save it a little bit. So that one I introduced because that was really bad. But I'm going to save cutting in all the triangles for a little bit after, so I'm not adding too much too quickly for you guys. One thing I will do though is I'll add another point here like we did earlier, and that's just so I make sure this works well. So what we'll do here is just add, and you can see how we're still considering that spacing and that positioning. So we're putting this at the peak of this fold rather than putting it down here at the bottom. Same there. Spacing these out a little bit nicer. And at this one, for that one, we can go to the bottom of this point. And we can add that triangle in there. So now we have a rough block for that section, and we can do the same thing here. So let's just move this. And we can merge these 2 points, right? So I'm just going to introduce 2 points here and then just move them into one triangle. That's just because we don't need them. But we don't need both of them. For this one, I don't need that. Okay. So let's go like this. Go like this, add a triangle there. I'll add this to the peak again. I'll move that over to the peak. And these ones, they're getting pretty dense here, right? So I'm just going to move that into a triangle because we don't need all of those coming out. And then we can move this. Now, I don't like having kites. This is a kite. You can see how awkwardly it's placed. It's not just like a normal quad. So with kites, I'll just insert a triangle into that because it just makes sense. Now, with this, remember, we have animation in mind as well as our silhouette. So you need to make sure to check this and say, okay, if the animator is to bend this ankle, will that be good enough for them? And as long as we introduce an edge loop here, and I would want an edge loop around here as well. So I'll just insert this. And we'll use multi-cut because we can't quad draw here anymore because there's triangles and everything. So this is when multi-cut becomes very useful. We'll just insert all around here until we loop back around. So you can see we're considering all of this while we're going ahead and doing the topology. And this is what you do when you're retopologizing a mesh. Go. So we'll just merge that into a triangle because we don't need it. Likewise with this, we don't really need it. We'll merge that into a triangle. And that does create a kite here. So you can see this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sides. That creates a pole, sorry. So this is a pole and it has 5 sides. Now, poles are used to change direction when you're modeling with them normally. But when we're modeling, we can just create poles where we see fit. So you usually don't want to create, you don't want to create a pole where animation is going to be happening a lot of the time. So for example, with the ankle, this doesn't really matter too much because the motion's so easy and there isn't much. But on a face, you can't create a pole where there's tons of movement. Like you can't have a pole right at the corner of the lips or right next to the eye, or you can have one next to the nose at the bottom point that doesn't really move. But you need to be careful about where you place poles. So let's just go back here. So if you didn't want to place that pole, we could just leave it as a triangle. That way this isn't a pole, there's no confusion, it's just easy to have this edge to form. Or we could place a pole. And again, this is very finite. No one's going to be looking at your topology skills that much, but I want you guys to be able to explain it just in case someone asks. You can say it's just a personal project. I didn't mind having a pole there because I wasn't going to animate it, so on and so forth. So this works now because you can see it's slightly more dense around the ankle, and we have a decent density going down. So let's keep going. And we also have the buckle factored in as well, and yeah. So let's just make sure that this point isn't neglecting these assets too much, and you can see that's helped. And for this one, to be fair, what I'm going to do is instead of merging these, I'm just going to cut this back out. So let's cut that over here, and all I want to do is push this point out of the surface, and you can see that got rid of a lot of that surface pushing through. So now I'm going to do another time lapse again and just continue going. And this time we'll probably just finish this base and then we'll begin cutting in all the triangles. So what I wanted to do here, I just thought I may as well mention this to you guys. So what I wanted to do here was, you can see that this point is fairly small, right, when I extruded that down. So I want to cancel this out because I don't want it to just keep on being a really small edge going around the bottom of the shoe. So I cancel that out by making it into a triangle. Then I'm adding this point, and I could just keep this one going around. There's a lot more space on this one, and we could just go around like that. Yeah, we'll go around like this. So I guess the key to that is just that when you have really small edges like that, cancel it out. You don't need edges that small. Just want to make sure we're getting this. And again, we're trying to watch the silhouette. Now, so you can see I've begun, instead of just, continuing this down, place this poly down, instead of continuing this down and stretching this, I've begun just pushing this one out, right? And that just makes a lot more sense for what we're doing, because that's going to get too stretched compared to everything else around it. This one's already a little stretched, so we want to reduce that as much as we can. And I'll just keep this going around and down here. Let's make sure that's going up. And what I'm doing now is I'm just going around the lip. So although certain things I don't define the edges of, for the side of the shoe, for the sole, I definitely want to do that, because if we are going to show off the shoe, which we probably will, we want players / we want people to see in our portfolio that we have that detail there, because it's an important one, right? It's just a characteristic of a shoe. It's like if you have a person, you have things like ears and eyes. With a shoe, you have a sole and you have a lip for that sole. Okay, so one thing that you guys should be aware of is that, for example, right now you can see we have all of these planes going down for the sole of the shoe. Now, if I press Control to try and draw a loop, the triangle, it's supposed to go around the triangle because, well, it's a triangle that we just made a quad, so that's why it's being redirected, which is perfectly fine. But it's also supposed to continue down these quads, right? So it's supposed to go down all the shoe. Now, if that happens to you guys, you just need to be aware that the pulleys haven't snapped together. So you'll see me fix that right now. So for example, you can see here this looks a little loose, so if we move this around you can see that the pulleys didn't snap. So we just literally need to move that, snap the pulleys, and now when I hold control over this in quad draw mode, select that quad draw, you can see that it goes up and we still have another one, and this happens quite often. Sometimes the pulleys don't snap, so just be aware. And you can see this one wasn't snapped either. So if it is snapped when we move these, you'll see that they'll just go like this. This one's snapped. So yeah, when we move these, you'll see that they all just move with it, right? You have a couple of them that aren't snapping. So yeah, this is just the issue with this. Let's move this. I'm just softening this to make sure. Now, a lot of these appear to not be snapping, but I'm not sure. So this just seems like a bug. Because again, you guys can see it appears to be snapping. All of them appear to snap in the recording, but they're acting like they haven't. And all of these were joining previously. So yeah, so just make sure those are snapping and we'll get back to it. So right now all I'm doing is inserting this loop. So I'm just inserting this straight line down here. Now you'll see me just insert this. So let me insert that there. And now for this one, we're just going to move this point. And a lot of these points, so remember when I mentioned that the verts need to be on the surface? A lot of these points have gone below the surface because there's multiple pieces of geo there. To get them back, all we need to do is select an edge. So just select, press 4, we'll select this edge, right? All of that edge is selected. Press 5 to go back into the normal view. I'll press W, remember to make sure this is on component mode, and we'll just move this up. And now you can see they're all coming up to the surface. So I'll just move this up ever so slightly till everything's there. Now that everything's there, we can move this one back down to make sure it's straight. Well, we don't even need that one. What I want to do is bring this one up and move this one over to the center, which this one also needs to come up. So now that's snapped together, I can delete these points. And then I can merge these together. And now we have the sole almost done. So I'll just do this, and I'll also just put these in triangles. So when I do this, it's not for anything special. When there's kites or awkwardly shaped pulleys, I prefer to just make them triangles because that just makes it easier for us to compute. And you'll see at certain edges later on down the line, you'll see what I mean with that. So it's one of those things that it's a wait and see. But we'll talk about it soon. So around here, you can see that the silhouette of the shoe, there's a lot of it that could be used here. So I'm just going to create an edge all around here. So you can see now that captures that a lot better. And at the part that this goes flat enough that we don't need these supporting loops, we are just going to merge this up and then delete all of these other loops. Likewise here, when this goes flat enough, which this part still isn't, we just need to make sure to move this out. And this just happens because we have a lot of overlapping shapes. So you don't need to worry if this is happening. It's just an artifact of overlapping shapes. A way to counter this is to use thin objects, but there's no point modeling with thin objects. You don't get the proper feel of the surface and things like that. So I always prefer modeling with thickness and making certain assets thin when they make sense. For this one, we'll just move this into the triangle. And yeah, we'll just move this there. Okay. So now that's the base of the shoe finished. We have all points covered and we have a nice model there. So after this, what do we then want to do? Well, we want to do two things actually. A very simple thing, we want to close this lip off, but I'll just do that later. But before that or after that, whatever order you guys want to go in, we need to make sure that the silhouette of this shoe works properly. So let's begin from the top and just work our way down. So now at the top, at the back, we need to make sure that this silhouette is captured. How do we do that? We just need to go to the multi-cut tool and we need to insert edges on the peak of that shape. So you can see this shape continues. The silhouette is still there at this point. So I'm actually going to insert this shape from here And we just need to insert triangles into this mesh to split this shape up. Now, the reason why this is acceptable is because we're going to make sure that all of these are quads or triangles. So, for example, you can see here that this has now moved itself out to the shape, and we can make sure by just moving this point out, which it is. And for shapes like this, we never want to have a poly that has more than 5 sides. So, or 5 sides or more. So this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we want to make sure that's either a quad, which this makes it a quad, or we can just make it a triangle by inserting another point there. Either one is fine, but you'll see why I do triangles mostly. But again, whichever one is fine. Now for this one, it's the same thing, but I've just inserted this point here because I needed somewhere to snap to so I could continue. And you can see this is now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 again. So we'll just move this up into a corner. And we'll continue this one. Now let's check. So this one's fine because this point's there. And then we can move this one up. So now when we look at that silhouette, you can see now we have a nice silhouette that this shape actually has captured. We no longer need to worry about that silhouette being way off. Now down here, we can add more. So for example, with this asset here, I'm just going to introduce a point there. But the more important thing about this part isn't actually introducing a horizontal, it's introducing a diagonal down here. So if I press enter there, you can now see that we'll be able to move this shape on the peak of this asset, and it'll capture that silhouette a lot better. So you'll see now that captures it a lot better. And again, this is something you guys will get used to. It's a part of the parcel when it comes to modeling, but you can see how we've introduced those triangles. Make sure this one stops and is connected there as a triangle. We've introduced those triangles. Everything is below 5 sides, so I'll just make sure to add this there, and that's now fine. So everything's below 5 sides, and that's just one shape. So now all we need to do is go on and do that again for everything. Now I'm going to speak through a few more difficult ones. This one's an easy one, so I'll do that one next just because it's quick. But after that, I'm just going to go in and you'll see me just work up this entire shoe. So for this, multi-cut tool, and for this one, I'm just going to go around here. And all we're doing is splitting these to now make them quads, 2 quads instead. And that's why we don't do this to everything, because we're splitting these to double this poly count or tri count. And yeah, we don't want to do that everywhere. We just want to do that in areas that we need it. Now the reason why, so let me just go here, you can see that all sinks in, and now all I need to do is introduce a loop here. So now that captures that silhouette really nicely, and we can close these off as triangles because right now they're kites, which again we don't want. So the reason why we can get away with doing this is because we've already put in the animation friendly topology, right? So the animation friendly topology are these edges that we put in before. You can see that these entire loops still work. The loops that we're adding in, they don't affect the animation friendly topology because that base is still there. So even though we're going to add triangles all over this to capture that shape, the majority of the mesh, or the mesh, is still animation friendly because it can still deform this way really nicely without worrying about too much. So that's why we need to begin like this and then keep going. Because if we introduce tons of triangles, then this wouldn't be animation friendly in the sense of you'd have a triangle coming down here, you could have another one. Let me demonstrate this quickly. So if we just began here and started doing this and said, okay, I'm going to capture this shape and let's capture that shape, and we can go here to make sure this is there, and we can now go here. You can see how this now doesn't have a central line to deform against. If this was to deform and bend, it would just look weird. So let me actually select this mesh. So if this was to deform, press B. Let me take off live selection. I just want to make sure to show you guys so you understand fully. But if this was to deform, you can see that this is how that shape would look. It's not just a nice smooth curve. There's these weird points coming out instead of just having a nice smooth curve. So just make sure all of this is back. And again, I'm just going to demonstrate a little bit of a harder edge for you guys. So this one needs some, and I'll keep going until I reach. So the harder one is this little bulge here, but this one needs some help. Ooh, let's go up. So for this one, I'll begin here. So we just need to begin when the silhouette is flat against this, and you can see that's this point. So we'll just continue this one going around. And when you get better at this, you'll model and keep all of this in mind as well. Now, that doesn't mean that you stop adding shapes to the silhouette, because you need those. You need those to make it feel high res, because your base geometry will feel a lot more high res when you have this detail. But it means that you place them in a way that's easy for you to notice, easy for animators to work with, and this is easy. So this is just me modeling, making everything flow. It's easy for everyone to work with, so on and so forth. So let's go there. This is fine. I'll leave this edge here. I could add more, but we really don't need to. So here we can see that this one could use more. It's not a must, but I'm just going to do it for the sake of showing you guys. So we can just cut through this shape here. And all we're doing when we cut through this shape is introducing a point, right? And now you can see that that now matches the silhouette a lot nicer. So very easy. And I'm going to make this one a triangle. And let me explain why I make this triangle now. So let's select this mesh by itself. So let's go like this. Oops. Let's go like this, and let's solo this mesh. So the reason why I make this a triangle is because when we look at this mesh, right, even when we have this selected, I want to find a worse example for you guys. Now you can see here that this quad, this poly or quad, when we're looking at it, it doesn't really know where it's going. It doesn't know whether it's pushing up against this tri or this tri. And when I say pushing up against, I mean being divided by this tri or this tri. Now, to explain this, I need to also let you guys know that everything is being represented by a triangle inside of Maya, Unreal Engine, any program that you're using. That's why there's always a triangle count as well. A face is just 2 triangles. You guys know this. Now, the building block of all of this are triangles, but they're just represented in quads because it's easier for us to understand, as I just demonstrated by going in and drawing out those quads manually and stuff like that. When it comes to deformation, it's easier for us to understand a quad than it is for us to understand a triangle. Therefore, we work in quads and then break them down to triangles. When you get your mesh inside of a games engine, that gets broken down to triangles anyway. What we're doing now is we're manually putting in the way that this gets broken down to a triangle. And I'll show you the two things that could happen. So if you bring this inside of a games engine, that's Marmoset, Toolbag, Unreal Engine, whatever engine you're in, one of 2 things could happen. And you're actually seeing it now, you're just not aware, for those of you who aren't aware. But the one of 2 things that could happen is the triangle could either get inserted this way if you automatically do it, and have a look at what happens when we come off of this tool. Oops. So when we come off of this tool and we look at this mesh now, you can see that we still get that awkward triangle happening here, and this isn't being deformed properly. Now have a look at what happens when we insert the edge along this way. Now we don't get that awkwardness. You can see that this now follows the shape around and it curves with it. So this triangle works a lot better for what we need than the other triangle does, because in the silhouette, this is smooth, whereas the other triangle is not smooth. So for this example, instead of having this without a triangle, we could go in and insert a triangle this way. And again, when we look in the silhouette, notice that this is now smoother. We no longer have the awkwardness of, let me just insert that triangle again. And this is just to really hammer the point home. So this is no longer like this. And you'll see that when we add this here, that's still awkward because you can see this shape is pointing down and then coming back out. We don't want that. We just want it to be flat against the silhouette. So that's why you manually insert these triangles, and that's what I'm doing when I'm working, when you see me adding in triangles randomly. So it is a thing that you have to just look at the silhouette and say, oh, this doesn't look like it's going down properly. I just need to add a triangle here, and I'll add a triangle from this position. And you'll see this triangle goes between these 2 points, and now you can see that where this is cutting down, that's no longer going to be there. So have a look. Now that's no longer there, it's just floating around. And that's what you want to get rid of. Now again, this is trial and error. You guys are going to have to do it and then recognize it, but you will get better at it. So let's keep on going. And the issue is that when you put it in any engine, again, Marmoset, Unreal, whatever engine you're working in, it does this automatically. So if we break down the problem areas, if we break down the problem triangles, you can see that on here there aren't any because these are just straight. it's here where it starts going diagonal and changing shape and stuff like that. But if we break down the problem areas, it won't change those triangles. It will just add triangles to the rest of it. And the way this happens is if we click on this mesh and I go here and I go to triangulate, you can see this just adds triangles automatically. Now, sometimes those triangles will work, sometimes they won't. For the most part, these ones are working fine, but we don't want to triangulate it because we don't need to. And when you triangulate it, now we no longer can select these loops. So have a look at what happens when we triangulate. So let's triangulate. Now, if we try to use quad draw, we can't select any loops because they're all being blocked by these triangles, right? So we don't need to triangulate, that automatically happens anyway, but we will do it to the geometry that needs it. So in saying that, a perfect example is this little curve here. This doesn't really have any direction right now, so we just want to manually put in that we want you to have the line running across it. So now when it turns, it's turning perfectly fine. So let's go ahead and do that hard curve, and then we'll jump back into time lapse. So in here, let's bring everything back, and now we want to do this fold, right? So with this fold, we're probably going to need 2 separate loops. So the place will begin is this one, because you can see here it's flat, and we're looking for that flat starting point. And then we can go up and around. And like I said, we could delete this side of the leg, but I don't mind it. So let's go ahead and we'll merge this one here. So now have a look. Most of them have popped out to the surface. Some of them may have not. All of them look like they have, so that's fine. But now we also need to capture this part being embedded in. So let's go ahead and capture this down here. And you can see this is a harder example, but it's still not hard, right? Once you know what you're doing and what you're looking for, this stuff is easy. But you just have to know, and someone just has to tell you. I remember when I was learning, this stuff was so alien to me. I wasn't sure if I was doing it right. If someone asked me, I'd say, yeah, you know, I did this, but I'm not sure if it actually works. Well, now I know it works, and now you guys know what works and what doesn't. So for this piece, we have this going around, and that's cool. We could always, so if you don't want to insert an entire edge loop, we could always just insert, like we did before, this point here. That way that pops this out, the silhouette gets a win. So let's just push this out onto the peak. So now the silhouette gets a little win, as you'll see there. And same thing here, right? So up here we can just do this. And the more curved the shape is, the more polys you need, but we don't need to add that all over the mesh, so we can just keep it at these points. And now you can see the silhouette's a lot better. And we can move this out. So when you look at this, sometimes you can afford to just move this point out, but keep note that when you move that point out, it's moving left and right as well. So sometimes you don't want it to move where it moves, sometimes you don't mind, so on and so forth. So just be careful with that. Now this point here, I'll keep those triangles there, but we want this to just go back in a little bit. And the real reason I'm doing that is just to support this point that's coming out in the silhouette that I can now see. So let's go there, and let's just bring this one up here. Cool. And I know that because I've went diagonally from here and I've left this big poly, I know that this one's going to have a little bit of issues when it comes to reading the silhouette. You can already see it here. So I'm just going to insert this, make this a triangle this way, and now you can see it just curves around. So that's when you see me inserting triangles, and that's what I'm thinking while I'm doing it. So the importance of this is not software at all. It's more how you think about this. In regards to software, you guys can find tutorials on how to use whatever equivalent there is of quad draw. You guys can use Topo Gun, whatever it is, it doesn't really matter. It's just how do we think about this and how do we break it down. Okay, so this one can go there. And now we can jump into the time-lapse video, and you guys can just see me work on this throughout the shoot. Okay, so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna leave this here for now. So let us have a little look. Now I'm gonna turn off the live selection. Now you can see I didn't close off the top, but for now we'll ignore that. So for this shoe, there's a few more steps we need to take. Now we have it matching the silhouette, and you guys can reference that. All I did, I moved it across, but you guys don't need to move it across. I'm just doing this, so oops. I'm just doing this so we can preview it. Where's the shoe gone? Strange. Let me just undo all of this. So all I'm going to do here is Control Shift Delete, and then I'm just going to freeze transform. So modify freeze transforms. All right. And now I'm just going to move this out so we can always go back to 0. So for this, the next steps after we finish the mesh, and I could keep on looking around this and adding different things, but you guys saw the entire process. So the next step would be me locking this off, but you guys can lock that off just to make sure. To lock this off, all we need to do, and by close this off, I'm just meaning cap the mesh, which is important because we don't want to see just flat geometry, right? We want the illusion to always be alive that this has thickness, even if it doesn't. So for this, all we need to do is move these points in, and this one doesn't need to be the tidiest because it's going on the inside. Other meshes should be covering this, and we can go all the way around here. So let me just do this quickly. Okay, so this is the final part of the video. I just recorded this and forgot to hit record, so but the final part is just finishing this mesh. So we just finished the retopology. I'm just gonna move this out so you guys can see that everything is there. Now we just need to make sure that the retopology is actually clean, and we don't have any 5-sided shapes, which for the eagle-eyed ones out there will see that I still have a five-sided shape here somewhere. But the thing is that a lot of the times it just gets hidden in all these shapes, right? So you don't see it. So we'll just make sure there is none of them there, and we'll speak about softening and hardening edges. So the first thing we'll do is we'll press 3. Now when you press 3, that goes to the smooth mesh preview, and I'm just going to isolate this object. Now when I press 3, you can see that this easily brings up any verts that aren't merged or any random errors in our mesh, which is what we want it for. So for all of these parts sticking out strangely, we know those verts aren't merged, and that just happened. You remember when we were going through the little trouble along here? That's when it happened. So in order to fix that, all we need to do is press 1 to go back into our normal preview mode, and then we'll just select all of those verts at the bottom because we know all of this is fine. It's just these verts at the bottom, and we'll go to shift right click, merge vertices, and then we're going to go to merge vertices. So now with that selected, what's happened is that those verts have been merged, and let me just press Ctrl Z. So if I press 3, you can see this is how they are before doing that operation, and if I press Ctrl Y, this is not going to redo it, but let me just do it again while they're selected, and we're in smooth mesh preview. So merge verts, you can see all of those have now been merged. And just make sure your distance threshold is turned down. If we start turning this up, if you put it to 1, you can see that merges a ton of the verts. So just make sure it's on something like 0.001 or 0.01, something along those lines, right? As long as all of the verts you actually want to merge are merged. Okay, so that's number 1. Now we know all of our verts are merged, and we would see any issues in this mode, and we're not, so that's good. Now let's press 1 again to go back into our normal preview mode. Now notice that there's all this blockiness on our object. All this is our hard edges inside of Maya. Inside of 3ds Max, I think you guys call this, it's just your, what's it called again? Your softening groups, something along those lines. So that's the same thing in Maya. So right now we just have all hard edges on. So all I'm going to do is select this, shift right click, hard and soften edges, and we're just going to soften all of the edges. Now, notice that all of our edges are now softer, but there are some artifacts along the bottom here. This doesn't have any artifacts. You can see this going a little bit darker. All that means is that we could add more polys inside of this area. So the transitions are just very strong. If you do notice anything really strange about your mesh, just select your mesh, go to mesh display. This is where you can also soften or harden your meshes. But what you want to do is go to unlock normals to make sure that there's no strange artifacting, which can happen while you're modeling or whatever. So that's a tip, but we want to get rid of this darkening that's happening here on this face. Now, the reason why that's happening is because this edge actually needs to be a hard angle edge in terms of softening and hardening, because the angles are too extreme for your normal maps to be read properly, or the normals on your mesh to be read properly. So what we want to do is just double click around this loop. So all the loops that are close to a 90-degree angle, basically. So from this transition to that transition, they're very close to a 90-degree angle. So when you do hard surface modeling, you have to do a lot of this. With organic things, it's only a few things, and you can see it's only happening to the bottom of our sole, which is very much hard surface pretty much. So here, what I want to do is just shift right click, go to soften and harden, and go to harden edges. And now you can see that that's perfectly fine, right? Now what we could also do is, because we have all of this part of the sole traced out as well, we could harden this edge. Sometimes I will. Just because it's a different asset and it makes sense for this to be hard as well, but you don't have to, because there aren't any huge errors that's coming up. So let's go soften, we can harden that. Now the only caveat, well, it's not a caveat, but the only thing to keep in mind when you do this is that you have to make sure that you cut these edges in your UVs. They cannot be together, otherwise you're gonna get artifacts and errors on your edges. When you bake your normal maps, the rays shoot out of these edges at a certain angle, and when you have a soft edge, it responds differently than a hard edge. So hard edges need to be cut at all of those edges where the hard edges meet. So here they need to be cut, all around the sole they need to be cut, and all around here. So we'll just need to make sure we do that. But this is why, well, no, it's fine. So yeah, we just need to make sure we remember to do that. Okay, so aside from those, everything else is fine. You can see everything else reads well. Now, how to fix those 5-sided shapes. So we have one here, this is where it was, and I'm just going to introduce a few more just to make sure that I get this point across to you guys. And no, that's just a normal 4-sided. Let's go here. So we have all of these points here, right? And we can go to an extreme example as well. Right, so we have this extreme example, which is way more than 5 points. So if we have things like this, and don't do this to your mesh, I'm just showing you as an extreme example. But if we have things like this, no, let me undo this one because that's just gonna break my mesh. But if we do have things like that, or any other weird instances, there are easy ways to find those inside of Maya without you needing to look through your mesh with a fine teeth comb and locate everything. So what we would do is select our mesh, then go to mesh, and then go to cleanup, and we need to make sure that in cleanup effect we go on select matching polygons, and in fix by tessellation we go on 5 with more than 4 sides, faces with more than 4 sides, sorry. So that way it will only select faces with 5 or more sides. Now as long as we have faces with 4 to 3 polys, that's perfectly fine, but 5 or more, that's not good, we don't have that. Okay, so now we just need to click apply. You don't need to worry about removing geometry because we're not removing anything, we're only selecting. And let's press apply, and now you can see that it highlights all of these polys that have more than 5 sides or more. So this is important because now you can see everywhere you need to fix. Now what if you don't have this? Well, all that happens, let me just undo these. Yep. And we only have one more. So if you don't have these, all that happens is that your mesh, so which one had the 5 sides? Where are you? I'm just trying to hunt down that one that had the 5 sides. I'm never going to find it now, am I? And that's where this comes in. So let's press apply, and there it is. So if we have this and we fix this, we need to make sure, so when I press apply, you can see that no faces are selected, meaning that this mesh is clean and it just gets deselected. Now, you need to make sure you have your poly count display up, because if I didn't have this up, maybe I wouldn't know, or I wouldn't know how much is actually selected. Because if I go like this, delete this one, and I'm over this side, and then I click apply, then I know that the mesh is still selected, but this tells me, oh, there are faces selected. If I'm not sure where those faces are, maybe it's a really big asset, you can press 4 to view that face, or you can just press F and it will just take you to that face, right? So easy ways to fix this issue. And to turn on your poly count display so that you can see visually as well, so when you press apply, you can see that no faces are selected. All we need to do is go to display, head up display, poly count, and just select that, and that will turn it on. Okay, so that's it for doing a low poly for an asset. So you can see it's a decent amount of time. All in all, with the talking and everything, it's about an hour and 45 minutes. Well, that's how long the video was. But this would be about an hour to do if I was just speeding through with my headphones on at work. So you don't need to rush or anything like that. It's just that it does take time to do these things. So no rushing. Just make sure your silhouette's really nice. Make sure your topology works for animation. We will be looking at that. And it will be all good.